One angler arrived with a bag full of expensive boilies, while another relied on nothing more than fermented beans. By the end of the session, the difference was hard to ignore. The angler using beans was getting consistent action, while the costly bait produced very little. Even more surprising, similar results were reported on multiple lakes and rivers by different fishermen. At first, it sounds like a lucky coincidence. But when the same pattern appears again and again, it becomes difficult to dismiss. Over time, many anglers tested fermented beans under different conditions, day and night, on still waters and flowing rivers, and the outcome was often the same. This simple bait repeatedly generated more bites than many premium commercial options. The most interesting part is that this method is far from new. Long before boilies, attractants, and modern carp products existed, anglers depended on natural ingredients to catch fish. Carp, bream, crucian carp, and grass carp were regularly caught using simple grains and legumes. While modern fishing has changed dramatically, some of those traditional methods continue to prove their effectiveness even today. Fishing in those days was built around simplicity. Most anglers used basic rods, simple line, and whatever bait was easy to find locally. Corn, wheat, barley, peas, and beans were common choices. But there was one practice that many fishermen relied on and that has largely been forgotten today: fermentation. Instead of using grains straight from the bag, anglers often allowed them to sit in water for several days until they began to ferment. They noticed that fish responded not only to the food itself but also to the distinctive scent created during the process. As the grains started breaking down, they released natural attractants that spread through the water and helped draw fish into the area. What makes this especially interesting is that fermented baits were effective even on waters where fish were known to be cautious. Old fishing records describe anglers catching fish consistently on fermented peas, corn, and other grains when more traditional baits produced very little action. At the time, nobody viewed it as a secret technique. It was simply a practical method that worked. Yet over the years, these traditional approaches gradually faded from the spotlight, despite continuing to produce results for those who still used them. Over time, the fishing world changed dramatically. By the 1980s and 1990s, tackle shops were overflowing with new products: boilies, dips, flavorings, attractants, and countless specialized additives. Anglers were increasingly encouraged to believe that catching carp required sophisticated baits and a growing collection of expensive gear. As modern products became more popular, many traditional methods slowly faded into the background. Not because they stopped working, but because fewer people talked about them. Fermented grains, once widely used by anglers, gradually disappeared from magazines, conversations, and fishing guides, even though they continued catching fish just as effectively as before. The interesting part is that carp themselves have not changed. These fish rely on an incredibly sensitive feeding system that allows them to detect tiny traces of food-related compounds in the water. Studies have shown that carp respond strongly to certain amino acids and natural feeding signals. Coincidentally, many of these compounds are produced during the fermentation of grains, peas, and beans, helping explain why these simple old-school baits continue to be effective after all these years. One factor that often gets overlooked is water temperature. Fermentation works best when conditions are warm enough for beneficial bacteria to become active. During this period, grains and beans begin releasing natural compounds that carp recognize as feeding signals. Once those signals spread through the water, fish can detect them from surprisingly long distances and often follow the scent directly to the source. This is one reason fermented baits can behave differently from many commercial products. Modern boilies are typically designed for long shelf life and stability, allowing them to remain usable for months. Fermented grains, on the other hand, rely on natural biological processes that create attractive compounds while the bait is actively breaking down. Those natural signals are often what make them so appealing to fish. Many anglers also assume that the strongest smell always produces the best results, but carp do not simply chase the most intense odor. They respond to specific chemical cues that indicate a safe and nutritious food source. The same idea applies to bait color. Bright colors may attract attention, but cautious, older carp often rely more on natural-looking food and realistic presentation. In many situations, a simple bait that appears familiar can outperform one that looks or smells exaggerated. Big carp become cautious for a reason. Over the years they encounter countless rigs, hooks, and baits, which teaches them to inspect potential food very carefully. A large fish can suck in a bait, test it, and reject it within a second if something feels unnatural. That is often the difference between anglers who regularly land trophy carp and those who spend hours watching their alarms without a single solid hookup. Another common mistake is assuming that expensive bait automatically means better results. From a carp's perspective, price and brand names are completely irrelevant. Fish respond only to the signals they detect underwater. If a bait looks, smells, and behaves like a natural food source, it can be just as effective, or sometimes even more effective, than a premium commercial product. This is why simple fermented baits continue to surprise anglers. Success often comes down to presentation and location rather than cost. The most productive areas are usually places where carp naturally search for food, such as depth changes, bottom transitions, reed lines, and zones where organic matter accumulates. When a bait is placed where fish already expect to find food, the chances of a bite increase dramatically. When fishing with fermented grains, complicated rigs are rarely necessary. A small sharp hook, a short hook link, and a compact bait presentation usually appear much more natural to feeding carp. Even something as simple as 2 beans on a hair rig can be enough. Just as important is avoiding the mistake of overbaiting. A small amount of feed that encourages fish to search often works better than covering the bottom with large quantities of bait. The more time you spend on the water, the clearer one lesson becomes. Successful fishing is built on observation, not magic ingredients. Anglers who consistently catch fish pay attention to details such as water temperature, wind direction, oxygen levels, and fish behavior. These fundamentals helped previous generations catch carp long before modern bait companies existed, and they remain just as important today. Despite all the new products on the market, the basic principles of fishing have changed very little. Fish do not respond to advertising, fancy packaging, or price tags. They react to natural feeding signals and conditions around them. That is why traditional methods continue to work, and why some simple baits can still compete with, or even outperform, modern alternatives. One mistake can completely ruin the effectiveness of fermented bait, and it catches many anglers off guard. People often try fermented peas or beans once, fail to get results, and assume the method simply doesn't work. In reality, the problem is usually not the bait itself but the stage of fermentation. There is a relatively small window when the bait is at its most attractive, and missing that window can make a huge difference. Some anglers start using the bait before fermentation has fully developed, while others leave it too long and allow it to go past its prime. The surprising part is that the gap between excellent results and poor results may be only a few days. Properly fermented grains can be highly attractive to carp, while over-fermented bait may lose much of its effectiveness. The process begins as soon as the grains are soaked in water. Naturally occurring microorganisms start breaking down sugars and creating new compounds. In warm conditions, fermentation progresses quickly, producing a mild sour aroma and a cloudy liquid. These natural scents disperse through the water extremely well, creating a feeding signal that carp can detect from a considerable distance. This is the stage many experienced anglers aim for because it often produces the strongest response from feeding fish. As fermentation progresses, the bait enters its most productive stage. After a few days, proteins within the grains begin breaking down into simpler compounds, releasing amino acids into the water. These substances are among the natural feeding signals that carp are highly sensitive to, which is why many anglers consider this period the sweet spot for fermented bait. When these compounds spread through the water, they help fish locate the food source more easily. Carp can detect surprisingly small amounts of these natural attractants, making properly fermented grains far more effective than their simple appearance might suggest. This is one of the main reasons fermented bait has remained successful for generations. The problem begins when fermentation continues for too long. As acidity increases, the scent changes from pleasantly sour to harsh and unpleasant. Eventually, the bait starts producing odors associated with decay rather than food. Instead of attracting fish, it can have the opposite effect. That is why timing is one of the most important parts of the entire process. Fortunately, preparing fermented bait is neither expensive nor complicated. Most anglers use common peas, beans, or chickpeas that can be purchased almost anywhere for very little money. With the right timing and preparation, these simple ingredients can become highly effective carp baits without the need for costly additives or complicated recipes. Preparing fermented bait starts with a very simple step. Dry peas or beans are soaked overnight so they can absorb water and expand. Once they are fully hydrated, they are transferred into a container and covered with water. One important rule is to avoid sealing the container completely, since fermentation produces gas and pressure can build up surprisingly quickly. After that, the process mostly comes down to patience. Within a day, small bubbles usually begin appearing, showing that fermentation has started. By the second day, the water often turns cloudy and develops a light sour smell. This is the stage where many anglers make mistakes, either using the bait too soon or failing to wait for it to reach its peak condition. After several days, fermentation becomes much more active. Bubbles rise continuously, some grains begin floating, and the aroma grows stronger while still remaining natural and pleasant. This is the period many experienced carp anglers target because the bait is releasing the highest concentration of attractive compounds into the water. For many fishermen, the ideal window arrives around the fourth day. At this point, the liquid surrounding the grains contains a rich mix of fermentation byproducts that can spread efficiently through the water. The scent is strong but not overpowering, creating a natural attraction trail that helps carp locate the feeding area and move toward the bait. The problem is that fermentation does not keep improving forever. After several days, the bait can begin moving past its most productive stage. The scent becomes harsher, acidity increases, and the natural attractive aroma gradually gives way to something far less appealing. Many anglers assume that a stronger smell automatically means better results, but carp often react negatively when fermentation goes too far. Temperature also plays a major role in the process. In cooler conditions, fermentation develops much more slowly and may take several extra days to reach the ideal stage. During hot weather, the opposite can happen, with the bait reaching its peak and declining much faster. That is why experienced anglers pay close attention to storage conditions and try to keep the process under control. One of the biggest mistakes beginners make is focusing only on the grains themselves. After fermentation, many people drain off the liquid and throw it away without a second thought. In reality, that liquid can be one of the most valuable parts of the entire process because it contains many of the compounds released during fermentation. A large portion of the scent and attraction created by the fermentation process ends up dissolved in the liquid. By discarding it, anglers may be throwing away one of the strongest natural attractants available. Understanding how to use both the grains and the liquid is often what separates average results from truly productive sessions. One advantage of fermented bait is that it can be used for more than just the hook bait. A small amount of the fermented liquid added to the fishing area can create a scent trail that spreads through the water and helps fish locate the spot. In lakes, the attraction gradually expands outward, while in rivers the current carries it downstream. Many experienced anglers have used this trick for years because it can draw carp into the area surprisingly quickly. The size of the bait matters as well. Many anglers assume that larger baits automatically mean larger fish, but cautious carp often treat oversized offerings with suspicion. Smaller baits such as beans or peas look far more natural because they resemble food items fish regularly encounter. As a result, carp tend to pick them up with greater confidence and are less likely to reject them immediately. A simple presentation is usually all that is needed. A couple of grains on a hair rig, a short hook link, and a sharp hook can be extremely effective. Because the bait feels natural, The fish often takes it without hesitation, allowing the rig to work as intended. Small details like this can make a significant difference in the number of successful hookups. Location is equally important. Carp rarely spend long periods in heavy current. Instead, they often hold in calmer areas such as current seams, eddies, drop-offs, old channels, and sheltered sections of a river. On lakes and reservoirs, productive spots are commonly found near weed beds, reed lines, submerged structure, and depth changes. These are the areas where carp naturally search for food, making them ideal places to present fermented bait. Water temperature is one of the most important factors in carp fishing. As temperatures begin to rise, carp become more active and spend more time searching for food. Fermented baits often perform best during these warmer periods because the fish are feeding more aggressively and are more willing to investigate natural food signals. Cold water changes everything. As temperatures fall, a carp's metabolism slows down and feeding activity drops significantly. Under these conditions, heavy baiting is usually a mistake. A small amount of feed paired with a subtle, natural-looking hook bait is often far more effective than creating a large baited area that fish may ignore. Weather conditions can also influence results. Sudden changes in atmospheric pressure often affect where carp position themselves and how actively they feed. During challenging conditions, fish may become less responsive to traditional presentations. However, fermented grains can still remain effective because they release a strong scent trail that helps fish locate the bait even when feeding activity is reduced. The more experience you gain, the more obvious one thing becomes: successful fishing is rarely about secret ingredients or miracle products. Consistent results come from understanding how fish respond to changing conditions and adapting your approach accordingly. Anglers who focus on the reasons behind fish behavior usually outperform those who simply follow trends without understanding them. Things become even more interesting on heavily fished waters. Many anglers have noticed that on lakes where carp see the same boilies and baiting strategies year after year, simple fermented grains can sometimes outperform modern baits by a surprising margin. The reason may have less to do with the bait itself and more to do with how carp learn from experience. Carp are far more capable of learning than many people think. Over time, fish can begin associating certain food items with danger. After repeatedly encountering the same baits, rigs, and feeding patterns, larger and more experienced carp often become much more cautious. Instead of feeding aggressively, they inspect potential food carefully and reject anything that feels suspicious. This helps explain why anglers sometimes see clear signs of fish activity without receiving any bites. The carp are still present and feeding, but they are approaching familiar baits with much greater caution. On waters that receive heavy fishing pressure, fish encounter the same presentations over and over again, making them increasingly wary of anything they have learned to associate with risk. That is where fermented grains can sometimes gain an advantage. They offer a more natural appearance and a different set of feeding signals than the baits carp encounter most often. By presenting something less familiar and more closely resembling natural food, anglers may be able to trigger bites from fish that have become cautious around conventional carp baits. What makes pressured carp waters so challenging is that fish do not need to understand hooks or rigs to become cautious. A few unpleasant encounters are often enough for a carp to start treating similar situations with suspicion. This learned behavior may persist for a long time, which helps explain why fish sometimes appear to vanish even when they are still feeding in the area. Think about what happens on a busy lake. Carp repeatedly encounter the same bait shapes, the same scents, and the same presentations. Over time, larger fish become increasingly careful. They may pick up a bait, detect the slightest resistance, and eject it almost instantly. To the angler, it looks like nothing happened at all, perhaps just a small indication on the alarm or a brief movement of the line. Now compare that to a small fermented grain. Its scent is natural, its appearance is familiar, and it closely resembles food that carp regularly find while feeding. Because it feels less suspicious, fish often take it with greater confidence. This can lead to more committed bites and better hookups, not because the bait is magical, but because it appears safer and more natural to the fish. Of course, bait is only part of the equation. Carp behavior is also heavily influenced by environmental conditions. Water temperature, oxygen levels, weather changes, and other factors all affect where fish hold and how actively they feed. Understanding these influences is often just as important as choosing the right bait. As water temperatures climb, oxygen levels naturally begin to drop. While that change may seem insignificant to us, it has a major impact on fish behavior. During the hottest periods of summer, carp often move toward areas where oxygen is more abundant, such as weed beds, reed lines, spring-fed sections, creek mouths, and places with noticeable water movement. These locations are frequently overlooked, yet they can become some of the most productive spots on the lake. Fermented bait has a particular advantage in such conditions because it releases a steady scent trail that spreads through the water over time. Even when rain muddies the water and visibility becomes poor, carp can still locate the feeding area by following those natural signals. There is another reason fermented grains can be so effective, but before getting to that, it is worth discussing a common mistake many anglers make. When fishing is slow, people often blame the weather, bad luck, or a lack of fish. In reality, the problem is often their baiting strategy. A common assumption is that more bait will attract more carp. However, heavily baited areas can actually make fish feed more cautiously. In many situations, a moderate and controlled approach produces better results, especially when targeting larger, more experienced carp that have seen countless baited spots before. One of the biggest baiting mistakes is simply using too much feed. When carp find a large concentration of food, they often slow down and feed more cautiously, picking through individual items without urgency. In many cases, a better strategy is to introduce small amounts of fermented grain at regular intervals. This keeps fish interested, encourages them to return repeatedly, and often results in more bites than heavily baiting the area from the start. The type of bottom is another detail that should never be ignored. Soft silt can swallow small grains and make them difficult for fish to locate. For that reason, areas with firmer bottoms, such as gravel, clay, sand, or shell beds, are usually far more productive. Some anglers even create a small feeding patch by introducing a compact mix of grain and clay, making the baited area easier for carp to find and investigate. Rig details matter just as much. A hook length that is too long can give fish more time to reject the bait, while one that is too short may reduce the natural movement of the presentation. Many experienced anglers prefer a moderate hook length because it provides a balance between natural presentation and effective hooking. Finally, never overlook hook sharpness. A perfectly sharpened hook often makes the difference between landing a fish and missing an opportunity. Successful anglers know that fishing is usually won through a combination of small details, and paying attention to those details consistently produces better results over time. Rivers can be especially effective for fermented bait because the current naturally carries the scent downstream. Instead of attracting fish only within a small area, the moving water creates a long scent trail that carp can follow back to the source. For this reason, many successful river anglers introduce bait slightly upstream from their rig, allowing the current to guide fish directly toward the hook bait. Another interesting advantage is that fermented grains can continue releasing tiny bubbles even after they settle on the bottom. While this may seem unimportant to anglers, it closely resembles what happens when carp naturally feed and disturb the substrate. Combined with the scent and appearance of the bait, these subtle signs help create a feeding area that looks completely natural to the fish. When carp encounter a spot that smells right, contains familiar food items, and shows natural signs of feeding activity, they often approach with much greater confidence. Several attraction triggers are working together at the same time, which is one reason fermented bait can be surprisingly effective on both rivers and lakes. However, many anglers make a mistake when trying to explain these results. They assume fish respond only to scent. In reality, carp use multiple senses when searching for food, and understanding that fact helps explain why some baits consistently outperform others even when their smell alone doesn't seem extraordinary. Many anglers assume that smell is the only thing that matters when carp search for food. In reality, carp rely on several senses at once. They detect chemical signals in the water, pick up subtle vibrations, and react to tiny changes in pressure around them. This is one reason why certain baits can be much more effective than they initially appear. Fermented grains do more than release an attractive scent. As the fermentation process continues, tiny bubbles and subtle water disturbances can be created around the bait. While these signals are almost impossible for us to notice, carp are extremely sensitive to them. Instead of triggering just one sense, fermented bait can provide multiple natural cues that help fish locate and investigate a feeding area. Despite these advantages, many anglers make a mistake that reduces the effectiveness of fermented bait. They prepare the grains correctly and choose a productive location, but continue using the exact same rig setup designed for large boilies. The problem is that fermented grains behave very differently underwater. A boilie is relatively large and heavy, so many carp rigs are built around the way fish pick up and handle that type of bait. Fermented grains are much smaller and lighter. Carp interact with them differently, which means the rig should complement that behavior. Ignoring this difference can lead to missed opportunities, even when the bait itself is highly attractive. Fishing with fermented grains requires a slightly different approach than fishing with boilies. Peas, beans, and chickpeas are smaller, lighter, and much easier for carp to pick up. Because of this, fish often take them far more cautiously. If the rig creates too much resistance, the carp may reject the bait before the angler even realizes a fish was there. What looks like a tiny indication on the alarm can actually be a fish testing the bait and moving away. Hook choice becomes especially important. Many anglers continue using large hooks because they are accustomed to fishing with bigger baits. However, oversized hooks can work against you when paired with small grains. A carp may detect the hook too quickly and eject the bait before a proper hookup occurs. This often leads to missed bites and fish that never get connected. For that reason, many experienced anglers prefer smaller, more discreet hooks when fishing fermented bait. Compact hook patterns provide a more natural presentation while still offering dependable hooking performance. Combined with a correctly balanced rig, they help reduce suspicion and increase the chances of a solid take. Sharpness is equally important. Even the perfect hook size can fail if the point is not razor sharp. A slightly dull hook may give a carp enough time to spit out the bait before the hook takes hold. That is why successful anglers pay close attention to hook condition, knowing that small details often make the biggest difference. One reason anglers sometimes struggle with fermented grains is that the issue often has nothing to do with the bait itself. More often, the problem lies in the rig. Many people try the method once, fail to catch fish, and assume the bait is ineffective. In reality, carp may be investigating the bait but detecting something unnatural before the rig has a chance to work properly. A hook that is too large is one common problem, but it is not the only one. Another critical detail is responsible for countless missed opportunities, yet many anglers never realize it. Even when a carp confidently picks up the bait, a poorly adjusted rig can prevent a successful hookup. One of the most overlooked factors is hair length. Many anglers simply use the same setup they would for large boilies. The result is that the grain sits too far from the hook. A carp can easily suck in the bait, inspect it, and spit it back out without ever touching the hook point. To the angler, it looks like the fish are not feeding, when in reality they may have visited the bait several times. That is why many experienced anglers keep the hair much shorter when using fermented grains. The bait should sit close to the bend of the hook so that when a carp picks it up, the hook is immediately in the best position to take hold. Small adjustments like this often make a much bigger difference than anglers expect. Another detail that can significantly affect results is lead weight. Many anglers automatically reach for heavy sinkers because they are useful for long-range casting. However, when fishing with fermented grains, too much weight can become a disadvantage. If a carp feels strong resistance immediately after picking up the bait, it may eject it before the rig has a chance to work properly. A more balanced setup often produces far better results. In many situations, A moderate lead provides all the hooking power that is needed while keeping the presentation subtle. The goal is to allow the fish to pick up the bait naturally without encountering sudden resistance during those first critical moments. Sometimes a fraction of a second is all it takes to turn a missed opportunity into a successful hookup. Hooklink material is another factor worth considering. Stiff hooklinks are popular in modern boilie fishing, but fermented grains often perform better with a softer presentation. A supple hooklink allows the bait to move more naturally and blend in with surrounding food items on the bottom. The less the bait resembles part of a rig, the more confidently carp tend to feed on it. Interestingly, many traditional anglers achieved excellent results with very simple setups. Rather than relying on complicated materials, they often preferred soft, unobtrusive hooklinks that behaved naturally underwater. Their success serves as a reminder that effective fishing is not always about adding more components. Sometimes it comes from keeping things simple. When it comes to baiting, simplicity is often the best approach. A small amount of fermented grain is usually enough to get started. Just a handful or two can create a scent trail that gradually spreads through the water and attracts nearby fish. On rivers, many anglers take this a step further by introducing bait slightly upstream, allowing the current to carry the attraction signal directly toward the fishing spot. Timing also plays a major role in success. During spring, as water temperatures begin to rise, carp become increasingly active after the winter slowdown. At this stage, they are actively searching for easy-to-digest food, making fermented grains particularly effective. The natural scent and nutritional signals released by the bait often match exactly what fish are looking for during this period. Summer requires a different approach. As oxygen levels decline in warm water, carp often feed most actively during the cooler parts of the day, especially early morning, evening, and overnight. Larger fish frequently move into shallow areas after sunset. Understanding these daily movements can be just as important as choosing the right bait. Autumn brings another shift in behavior. Carp begin feeding more aggressively as they prepare for winter, spending longer periods searching for food. During this time, anglers can often increase their baiting slightly and take advantage of the fish's heightened feeding activity. Adjusting your strategy to match the season is one of the keys to getting the most from fermented bait. Fall is often considered one of the best seasons for targeting carp. As temperatures begin to drop, fish spend more time feeding and building energy reserves before winter arrives. They tend to visit feeding areas more frequently and often become less cautious than they are during the hottest months of the year. This increased activity is one reason many anglers enjoy some of their most productive sessions during autumn. Winter, however, brings a completely different situation. As water temperatures fall, a carp's metabolism slows significantly. Fish become less active, feed less often, and are far more selective about what they eat. Under these conditions, large baited areas are usually less effective. A subtle presentation with a small amount of bait often produces better results than trying to attract fish with heavy feeding. Water clarity also plays an important role. Slightly stained or muddy water can be ideal for fermented bait because carp rely more heavily on scent when visibility is reduced. The natural compounds released during fermentation help fish locate the feeding area even when they cannot see it clearly. Clear water requires a more cautious approach. Carp become more aware of rigs, line, and unnatural presentations. Successful anglers often scale everything down, using lighter tackle, smaller amounts of bait, and more discreet setups. The more natural the presentation appears, the greater the chance of convincing a cautious fish to feed confidently. One factor that often gets overlooked is wind. On lakes and reservoirs, a steady wind can gradually push surface water, natural food, and scent trails toward a particular shoreline. As food accumulates, carp frequently move into those areas to feed. This is why experienced anglers often consider wind direction before they even make their first cast. Choosing the right location based on wind movement can sometimes have a bigger impact than changing baits or rigs. Areas where the wind is pushing water often concentrate both natural food and feeding fish. Instead of focusing only on casting distance or convenience, successful anglers look for places where conditions naturally encourage carp to gather. Bites on fermented grains can also be surprisingly subtle. Rather than producing explosive runs, fish often pick up these natural baits with confidence and very little hesitation. The first indication may be nothing more than a slight line movement or a single beep from the alarm. Reacting too quickly can sometimes cost you the fish. Patience is often the better option. Giving the carp a moment to move away allows the rig to tighten naturally and improves the chances of a secure hookup. When you combine natural bait, careful presentation, proper location selection, and an understanding of fish behavior, it becomes clear why fermented grains have remained effective for generations. Their success comes from working with the fish's natural instincts rather than trying to force a reaction. This raises an interesting question. If fermented grains have been catching carp for generations, why are they mentioned so rarely today? Why have techniques that were once common on rivers and lakes been replaced by endless discussions about the latest products and bait innovations? Part of the answer lies in the way the modern fishing market works. Many popular carp products are designed to be used up and replaced regularly. Boilies, dips, flavorings, pellets, and other additives all require continual purchases throughout the season. As a result, anglers can spend a surprising amount of money on bait alone over the course of a year. Fermented grains offer a very different approach. A single bag of peas, beans, or chickpeas can provide enough bait for numerous sessions at a fraction of the cost of many commercial alternatives. Once prepared, a batch can often be used across multiple trips, making it both practical and affordable. That does not mean modern products are ineffective. However, it helps explain why traditional methods often receive less attention despite continuing to produce results. Simple, low-cost approaches rarely generate the same excitement as new products, yet many anglers still rely on them because they remain effective, accessible, and easy to prepare. The truth is that these traditional methods never disappeared because they stopped catching fish. Carp biology has remained the same. Fish still respond to natural feeding signals such as amino acids, fermentation compounds, and food sources that resemble what they encounter in their everyday environment. Properly fermented grains happen to produce many of those signals naturally, which is why they continue to work after all these years. If we simplify everything into a practical system, the first step is preparing the bait correctly. Ordinary peas, beans, or chickpeas are more than enough. Soak them overnight, place them in a container, cover them with water, and allow fermentation to develop. After several days, the water should become cloudy, small bubbles will appear, and a mild sour aroma will develop. These are usually good signs that the bait is approaching its most productive stage. Once the bait is ready, the next priority is location. On rivers, productive spots often include current seams, eddies, slack water areas, and the edges of deeper channels where carp naturally pause to feed. On lakes and reservoirs, depth changes, reed beds, underwater ledges, and transitions between different bottom types are often excellent places to start. Areas with firm bottoms such as gravel, clay, or shell are especially attractive because they allow fish to locate food more easily. Many successful anglers follow this simple formula: prepare the bait properly, place it where carp naturally search for food, and let the fish's instincts do the rest. While the details matter, these fundamentals are often responsible for the majority of consistent results. When it comes to baiting, less is often more. One of the most common mistakes is introducing too much feed at once. A small amount of fermented grain is usually enough to attract fish and hold their attention. Adding a little of the fermented liquid can enhance the scent trail even further. Instead of dumping large quantities into the swim, many successful anglers prefer to top up the area occasionally with small portions to keep carp interested without allowing them to feed too heavily. The rig should be kept simple and balanced. A small sharp hook, 2 grains on a short hair, a soft hook link, and a moderate lead create a presentation that looks natural and allows the bait to work effectively. None of these components are particularly complicated on their own, but together they help maximize the advantages of fermented bait. One of the biggest lessons in carp fishing is that success rarely comes from a single secret trick. More often, it is the combination of many small details working together. Properly fermented bait, a productive location, sensible baiting, and a well-balanced rig all contribute to better results. When one piece is missing, the entire system becomes less effective. Observation is the final piece of the puzzle. Bites on fermented grains are often subtle, and reacting too quickly can cost you fish. A slight line movement, or a single beep may be all the indication you get. Remaining patient and allowing the fish a moment to move off with the bait often leads to a much more secure hookup than striking immediately at the first sign of activity. A few small adjustments can make a noticeable difference on the water. After heavy rain, when visibility drops and the water becomes murky, increasing the amount of fermented grains slightly can help fish locate the area more quickly. In clear water, the opposite is usually true. Carp rely more on sight, so a subtle approach with less feed and a more natural presentation often produces better results than creating a large baited spot. When smaller fish become a nuisance, switching to larger grains such as chickpeas or large beans can be an effective solution. Carp can handle these baits easily, while smaller species often struggle with them. On rivers, another useful tactic is to mix fermented grain with clay and form small balls. As they break down in the current, they release scent and food particles downstream, creating a natural trail that guides fish toward the fishing area. Some traditional anglers also use the simple fermentation trick, adding a small amount of sugar or honey to help the process start more quickly. The extra sugars provide fuel for beneficial bacteria and encourage fermentation. The key is not to overdo it, since too much can cause the mixture to spoil rather than develop properly. Storage is equally important. Once the grains reach the desired stage, refrigeration can slow fermentation and help preserve the bait for future trips. Keeping the bait cool allows it to remain effective for an extended period, making it possible to prepare a single batch and use it across several fishing sessions without having to start the process all over again. The biggest takeaway is that successful fishing has very little to do with how much money you spend. Consistent results come from observation, experience, and understanding how fish behave. Carp do not care about brand names, attractive packaging, or the price of a bait. They respond to natural feeding signals. Sometimes the most effective bait is not found in a tackle shop at all, but among the simple grains and legumes available in any grocery store. Long before modern bait companies appeared, anglers were catching carp with basic ingredients such as grains, bread, dough, and other natural foods. What made them successful was not expensive equipment, but their ability to read the water. They paid attention to weather conditions, fish movements, and seasonal patterns, learning something new from every trip they made. Fishing knowledge can be shared, but real skill only develops through experience. You can watch videos, read articles, and listen to advice, but true understanding comes from spending time on the bank and observing what is happening around you. That is why no method should be accepted blindly. The best approach is always to test it yourself and see how it performs on your local waters. Perhaps on your next session, while other anglers are reaching for the latest commercial bait, you will be using a simple bucket of fermented peas, beans, or chickpeas. If you do, you may discover why these traditional methods have survived for generations and why, even today, they continue to surprise anglers with just how effective they can be.